If I could have a conversation with anybody from history, living or dead, I have always said it would be Princess Alice of Battenburg. And it's not a secret that I have a fascination with the British royal family. One of the most fascinating members of the British royal family happens to be, in my opinion, and has always been and will always be Princess Alice of Battenburg. You're probably wondering, why does that name sound so familiar? Well, if you know your history on, or just know the British royal family in general, then you know that that Queen Elizabeth's mother-in-law was Princess Alice of Battenburg, who was the mom of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and the paternal grandmother of King Charles III. Welcome to People of History, where today we are going to be talking about, you guessed it, Princess Alice of Battenburg. And why are we talking about her? Well, why is she so significant? To answer your question, um, she played a great part in World War II in helping Jewish refugees. And I think that's something we need to think about. World War II was a costly and deadly war that a lot of people seem to need to remember. And I know there's like a whole hoax saying, oh, the Holocaust did happen, yada, yada, yada. Well, it did happen. It killed 6 million people, give or take. And we need to remember that. And a shining example, I've talked about a lot of people who have helped, but she has always been the one person I have been excited to talk about since I decided to start People of History. And here we are. Now, you're probably wondering, why does how did this great granddaughter Queen Victoria? Well, after marrying her Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark in 1903, she adopted the style of her husband, becoming Princess Alice of Greece and Denmark. And it is also important to note that, like I said, she is a great granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She was born at Windsor Castle and grew up in the UK, Germany, and Malta. By birth, she was a Hessian princess who is a member of the Battenberg family, a morganatic branch of the House of Hesse in Darmstadt. Another thing about her is that she was deaf, and she lived in Greece until her exile. And most of the Greek royal family in 1917, on returning to Greece a few years later, her husband was blamed in part of the country's defeat of the Greco-Turkish War, and her family was once again forced into exile until the restoration of the Greek monarchy in 1935. In 1930, Princess Alice was diagnosed with schizophrenia and committed to a sanatorium in Switzerland. Therefore, thereafter, she lived separately from her husband, and after recovery, she devoted most of her remaining years to charity work in Greece. She stayed in Athens during the Second World War, where she would shelter Jewish refugees, for which she was recognized as righteous among the nations by Israel's Holocaust Memorial Institution, Yad Vashem. And after the war, she stayed in Greece and founded a Greek Orthodox nursing home, the Order of the Nuns, known as the Christian Sisterhood of Martha and Mary. And after the fall of King Constantine II of Greece and the imposition of military rule in Greece in 1967, Princess um the princess let me try that again. She was invited to go by her son and daughter-in-law to live at the Buckingham Palace in London, where she died 2 years later in 1988. Her remains were transferred from the vault of her birthplace, um, Windsor Castle, to the Church of Mary Magdalene at the Russian Orthodox convent at the same name on the Mount Olives in Jerusalem. So, let's talk about her early life now. She was born February 25th, 1885, at Windsor Castle at the presence of Queen Victoria. You know, there was something very poetic, though, about dying in the same place you were born. Think about it. She was the oldest of Prince Louis of Battenberg and his wife, Princess Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine. And her mom was the eldest daughter of Louis the Sixth. No, wait. Fifth, my bad. And Grand Duke of Hesse, and Princess Alice of the UK, the Queen's second daughter, and she was the eldest son. Now, her father was the eldest son of Prince Alexander of Hesse and by Rhine, through his morganatic marriage to Countess Julia Hawk, who was created Princess of Battenburg in 1858 by Louis III, Grand Duke of Hesse. Her three younger siblings were Louise, George, and Louise, who later became Queen of Sweden, and the Marquess of Milford Haven and Earl Mountbatten of Burma, respectively. Now, she spent most of her childhood between Darmstadt, London, um, Jurgenholm, and Malta, due to her father being a naval officer. Um, and her mom noticed that was slow to learning to talk and became concerned by her indistinct pronunciation. Now, eventually she was diagnosed with deafness after her grandmother, the Princess of Battenburg, identified the problem and took her to see an ear specialist. With encouragement, Alice learned to both read lips and speak in English and German. She was educated privately, she studied French, and after her engagement, she learned Greek. And her early years was spent in the company of royal relatives. That she was a bridesmaid at the wedding of Prince George, Duke of York, and Princess Mary of Teck in 1893. A few weeks before her 16th birthday, she attended Queen Victoria's funeral at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, and shortly afterwards she was confirmed in Anglican faith. Now, Alice would meet Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, who was known as Andrea within the family. And he was the fourth son of King George the First of Greece and Olga Konstantinova of Russia, while in London for King Edward VII's coronation in 1902. They married in a civil ceremony on October 6, 1903 in Darmstadt, and that following day, they were two religious there were two religious ceremonies, one Lutheran at the Evangelical Castle Church and one in Greek Orthodox in the own Russian chapel, and she adopted the style of her husband, becoming Princess Andrew. And the bride and groom were closely related to the ruling houses of the UK, Germany, Russia, Denmark, and Greece. That is a lot of countries. Okay. um, and their wedding was one of the great gatherings of the descendants of Queen Victoria and King Christian IX held before World War One. Now, the prince and the princess had five children: Margarita, Theodora, Cicely, Sophie, and Philip. And at the wedding, Prince Andrew continued his career in the military, and Princess Alice became involved in her charity work. In 1908, she visited Russia for a wedding of the Grand Duchess Marie of Russia and Prince William of Sweden. While there, she talked to her aunt, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodora, who was formulating plans for the foundation of the Order of Nurses. Now, Princess Alice attended the laying of the foundation stone for her aunt's new church. Later in that year, Elizabeth began giving away all her possessions in preparation for a more spiritual life, and on their return to Greece, the prince and the princess found a political situation worsening, as the Athens government had refused to support the Grecian parliament, which was called the Union of Crete, with the Greek mainland, and a group of dissatisfied officers formed a Greek nationalist military league and eventually led Prince Andrew to resignation from the army and rise to power. Now let's talk about um now with the advent of the Balkan Wars, Prince Andrew was reinstated in the army, and Prince Andrew also acted as a nurse, assisting in operations, setting up field hospitals. Not Princess Andrew, Princess Alice. I'm sorry, I can't get you saying Princess Andrew. I really can't. But Princess Alice. She worked for King George V. She was awarded her Royal Red Cross in 1913 during World War One. Her brother-in-law, King Constantine I of Greece, followed a neutrality policy despite the democratically elected government of Venizelos, so supporting the Allies. Now, Princess Princess Alice and her children were forced to shelter-in-place cellars during the French bombardment in Athens on December 1st, 1916. By June 1917, the king's neutrality policy had become so untenable that she and other members of the Greek royal family were forced into exile when King Constantine abdicated. For the next few years, most of the Greek royal family lived in Switzerland. The global war effectively ended much um, of the political power in the years of Europe's dynasties. The naval career of Prince Andrew's father, Prince Louis of Battenburg, had collapsed. Prince Alice's father, Prince Louis of Battenburg, had collapsed in the beginning of the war in the face of anti-German sentiment in Britain. And at the request of King George V, he relinquished the Hessian title Prince of Battenburg in the style of Serene Highness on July 14, 1917, and anglicized the family name to Mountbatten. The following day, the king created him Marquess of Milford Haven in the peerage of the UK. The following year, um, two of Princess Alice's aunts, Empress Alexandra Feodora Russia and Duchess Elizabeth Feodora Russia, were murdered by the Bolsheviks after the Russian Revolution. By the end of the war, the Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian empires had fallen, and Prince Andrew's uncle, Ernst Louis, Grand Duke of Hesse, was deposed. On Constantine's restoration in 1920, um, the prince and princess briefly returned to Greece, taking residence in Corfu on Mount Repos. But after the defeat of the Hellenic army in the Greco-Turkish War, a revolutionary committee under the leadership of Colonels Nicholas Palacios and Stylanius Gonatos seized power and forced the king into exile once again. Prince Andrew, um, who had served as a commander for the Second Army Corps during the war, was arrested, and several former ministers and generals were arrested at the same time and were shot. And were also in mortal danger. After a show trial, he was sentenced to banishment, and the prince and the princess, all and their children, also fled Greece aboard a British cruiser, the HMS Calypso, under the protection of the British naval attaché. So let's talk about illness now. Now, the family was settled into a small house that was loaned to them by Prince George of Greece in Denmark at St. Cloud on the outskirts of Paris, where Princess Alice helped in charity um, shop for Greek refugees, and she became deeply religious. In October 1928, she would convert to the Greek Orthodox Church. In that winter, she translated into English her husband's defense of his actions during the Greco-Turkish War. Soon after, she began claiming that she was receiving divine messages and that she had healing powers. Yeah, I know. Very, very weird. But in 1930, her behavior became increasingly erratic, and she asserted that when she was in communication with the Buddha and Christ, she was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. First by Thomas Ross, a psychiatrist specializing in the treatment of shell shock, and subsequently by Sir Maurice Craig, who had treated future King George VI before he had speech therapy. The diagnosis was confirmed at the Ernst Sanatorium in Tegel, Berlin. She was forcibly removed from her family and placed in the sanitarium in Switzerland. It was a famous and well-respected institution with celebrity patients. About many who were there at the same time as the princess. And Binswanger also was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Both he and Simmel sought advice from Sigmund Freud, who concluded that the delusions derived from sexual frustration and suggested X-raying her ovaries in order to kill her libido. She continued to assert her sanity and made repeated efforts to leave the sanitarium. Now, during Alice's lone convalescence, she and Prince Andrew drifted apart, and her daughters all married German princes in 1930 and 1931. She did not attend any of their weddings, and Prince Philip went on to the UK to stay with his maternal uncles, Lord Louis Mountbatten and George Mountbatten, second Marquess of Milford Haven, and his maternal grandma, the Dowager Matriarch of Milford Haven. Now, that's a lot of titles. I'm sorry, but that is what is with the titles. But anyway, we gotta differentiate them somehow. But Princess Alice remained in Switzerland for 2 years, but after a brief stay at a clinic in Marino in northern Italy, she was released and began her internment incognito existence in Central Europe. She maintained contact with her mom, but broke off ties to the rest of her family until the end of 1936. In 1937, her daughter Cicely, her son-in-law George, and two of her children were killed in an air accident at Austin, and she and Prince Andrew met for the first time in 6 years at the funeral. She resumed contact with her family and in 1938 returned to Athens to work with the poor. It was while living in a two-bedroom flat near the Menaki Museum. Now, I said earlier that I talked a little bit earlier about World War II and her actions, but I want to go into a little bit more detail now. Now, during World War II, Princess Alice was in this difficult situation of having son-in-laws fighting on the German side and a son on the British Royal Navy. Her cousin, Prince Victor zu Elberg-Skollenberg, was the German ambassador in Greece until until the occupation of Athens by the Axis forces in April 1941. She and her sister-in-law, Princess Nicholas of Greece, lived in Athens for the duration of the war while most of the Greek royal family remained in exile in South Africa. She moved out of her small flat and into her brother-in-law George's three-story house in the center of Athens, where she worked with Red Cross and helped organize soup kitchens for the starving, and flew to Sweden to bring medical supplies to the pretext of visiting her children, Crown Princess Louise. She organized two shelters for orphan and lost children and nursing circuit for poor neighborhoods. Now, the occupying forces apparently presume Prince Andrew was Princess Alice was pro-German. As one of her son-in-laws, Prince Christoph of Hesse was a member of the NSDAP, and the Waffen SS and another Borto Markave had been invalidated out of the German army in 1940 after an injury in France. Nonetheless, when visited by a German general who asked her if there was anything he could do to help her, she replied, "You could take your troops out of my country." You go, girl. See, this is why I really want to meet her. She was a Spitfire. And after the fall of the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, in September 1943, the German army occupied Athens, where a minority of Greek Jews sought refuge, and the majority were deported to Nazi concentration camps, where all 2,000 had died. And it was during this period Princess Alice hid Jewish widow, Rachel Cohen, and two of her 5 children, who sought to invade the Gestapo and deportation to death camps. In 1913, Rachel's husband, Hamaki Cohen, had aided King George First of Greece. In return to King George had offered him the services that he could perform should Cohen ever need it. Years later, during the Nazi threat, Cohen's son remembered this, and he appealed to Princess Alice, who was with Princess Nicholas, who only turned the only two remaining members of the royal family left in Greece. Princess Alice honored her promise, and she saved the Cohen family. And while in Athens, when Athens was liberated in October 1944, Harold Macmillan visited Princess Alice and described her as living in humble, not to say somewhat squalid conditions. In a letter to her son, she admitted that in her last week before liberations had no food except bread and butter and no meat for several months. By early December, the situation in Athens was far from improved, and the communist guerrillas were fighting the British for control of the capital. As the fighting continued, Princess Alice was informed that her husband had died, just as hopes as a post-war reunion for the couple was rising. They had also not seen each other since 1939. During the fighting, to the dismay of the British, she insisted on walking the streets, distributing rations to the policemen and children, and contravention of the curfew order. When warned that she was in danger of being struck with a stray bullet, she replied, "They tell me that you don't hear the shots and that kills you, and in any case, I am deaf, so why worry about that?" Princess Alice was a baddie. I will say that to the day I die. And this is part of the reason why I want to meet her. Like, I would love to just sit down, meet with her, talk to her in person, and be like, okay, talk to me, tell me what was this like. One day when I get to heaven, I will get to talk to her. Now, let's talk about her widowhood. Now, she returned to the UK in April 1947 to attend the November wedding of her only son, Philip, to Princess Elizabeth, the elder daughter and heir presumptive of King George VI. And she had some of her remaining jewels used as in Princess Elizabeth's engagement ring. On the day of the wedding, her son was created Duke of Edinburgh by George VI. For the wedding ceremony, Princess Alice sat in the head of the family on the north side of Westminster Abbey, opposite of the King, Queen Elizabeth, and Queen Mary. And Princess Alice's daughters were not invited to the wedding because of their anti-German sentiments in Britain following World War II. In January of 1941, the princess was founded a nursing order of the Greek Orthodox nuns in the Christian sisterhood of Martha and Mary, modeled after the convent that her aunt, the martyred Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodora, has founded in Russia in 1909. Now, she trained on the Greek island of Tynos, established a home in the order of the hamlet north of Athens, and undertook 2 tours in the U.S. in 1950 and 1952 in an effort to raise funds. Her mom was baffled by her actions, saying, "What can you say of a nun who smokes and plays canasta?" Was she Jewish? That was she Jewish was just my joke. Anyway, Princess Alice's daughter-in-law, became Queen of the Commonwealth Realms in 1952, and the princess attended a new queen's coronation in June of 1953, wearing a two-tone gray dress, wimple in the style of a nun's habit. Now, the order eventually fell through a league of suitable applicants. In 1960, she visited India at an invitation who and she was and he was impressed by her interest in the Indian religions and thought for her own spiritual quest. The trip was cut short and unexpected, where she unexpectedly took ill, and her sister-in-law Amina Mountbatten, who was the Countess Mountbatten of Burma, who happened to be passing through Delhi on her own tour, but had to smooth things over with the Indian host, who were taken aback by her sudden change of plans. And she later claimed that she held an out of body experience where Edwina continued her own tour and died a month later. And she was increasingly deaf and in failing health that Princess Alice would leave Greece for the last time on April 21st, 1967. Um, due to Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip's insistence to reside permanently at Buckingham Palace in London. and King Constantine II and Queen Anne Marie of Greece went into exile that December after a failed royalist counter coup. Now, I want to talk about her death and her burial real quickly. Um, Now, despite the complicated suggestions of Sandy in her life, Princess Alice remained lucid but physically frail. She died at Buckingham Palace December 5th, in 1969, at the age of 84. She left no possessions and having given everything away. Initially, her remains were placed at the Royal Crypt at St. George's Chapel on December 10th. But before she died, she had expressed that she wanted to be buried at the convent of St. Mary Magdalene in Gethsemane on Mount Olives in Jerusalem, near her aunt. When her daughter, um, pr- when her daughter Princess George Wilhelm of Hanover complained that it was too far for them to visit her grave, Princess Alice suggested, "Nonsense, there's perfectly good bus service," and her wish was realized August 3rd, 1988, when her remains were transferred from the crypt below to the church. Now, like I said, there's a lot that I want to say more about her, but we're almost 3 minutes in, and I don't want to take more of your time. But she was a baddie. I will say that through and through, and she was one of the most interesting members of the British royal family. And she is a saint. She truly is. I mean, given her philandering husband and all of that, yeah. But anyway, thank you for joining me. You can see who we talk about next time on People of History.